Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Marilee McFarland, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Field Relations here at Principia. And we are so grateful that you are with us today. Our talk today on the New York Times bestseller, Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. I just hope that you enjoyed reading the book as much as I did. I'm looking forward to Ann Pearson walking us through this epic journey of these 9 incredible men and their quest for gold in 1936. This book talk serves as our final event as part of the 2020 Principia College Virtual Homecoming. We had so much fun engaging with over 300 alumni and friends around the world who participated in the virtual 5K, the hundreds of people that attended the alumni concert online, or watched one of the 7 tour videos of campus. If you haven't had a chance to tune into the concert or virtually step back on campus, we will put the link to view them in the chat box and invite you to listen to the concert, watch the videos, have a special pub shake with Principia College President John Williams, and just feel at home at Principia while we're all staying home all around the world. I wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events we have. On Tuesday, November 17th at both noon and 7 p.m., Principia College Assistant Professor Dr. Sarah Andrews will give an insightful talk on the state of democracy in the world. With massive protests in places like Hong Kong and Hungary that are making headlines and illustrating both threats to democracy and popular demand for democracy, Dr. Andrews will look globally at places where democracy is progressing and places where it's backsliding, presenting trends and offering some explanation for those trends. So we're looking forward to that event on November 17th. We will be announcing our November book club pick, which will take place on Monday, November 3rd, at the end of this week. So stay tuned for the title and lots more information. We also hope that you will join us in December for all of our virtual Christmas festivities. So we're taking those beloved Christmas sings online to some traditional Christmas sing caroling parties, as well as Christmas concerts and lots more. So stay tuned for more information on all of that, and we hope to see you in December as we jingle and mingle together. Stay tuned for more information on everything, and you can always visit principiaalumni.org to find out more and to RSVP for the events. Our talk this afternoon will be moderated by Kevin Kapp, the Director of Annual Giving and Development Programs. Following the talk, Ann Pearson will be answering any questions that you have submitted in the Q&A box. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the talk to share your insights from the book. The talk today is being recorded and will be posted in the next couple of days on our virtual events webpage. You can also find the recordings of the concerts and talks over the last 6 months there. We will post those links again in the chat box. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Ann Pearson is the Director of Athletics at Principia College. Ann brings to the conversation today extensive coaching experience ranging from high school students to Olympic athletes. Prior to assuming the role as the athletics director at Principia in the summer of 2019, she had worked for Principia for 20 years from 1995 through 2005, serving as the head women's basketball coach and head men and women's track coach. Ann has extensive athletics experience in coaching, strength and conditioning, and NCAA compliance for various schools and colleges and universities, including Princeton University, University of Missouri, and Principia. In addition to coaching at the highest caliber of athletes, Ann is an accomplished athlete herself, competing in college at the University of Virginia in both track and field and basketball. It is through this lens as an NCAA champion and making her way to the Olympic trials in 1984 that she fell in love with this book. And we're grateful that Ann is leading this conversation as we look at the history, grit, and teamwork that this story of the Boys in the Boat holds. So Ann, I turn it over to you. And I think you have to
I'll unmute. Thank you, Marilee, for that lovely introduction, and I'm going to look forward to some of those virtual events that are up and coming. I'm really excited to talk to all of you about this book. It's one of my favorites. I chose it because I relate to it on many levels. I ran track, qualified for the Olympics, and later coached some Olympic hopefuls. I ran the 400-meter dash, a grueling race that involved a lot of pain. So George Pocock's quote in the opening chapter of the book resonates with me. He said, "In a sport like this, not much glory. There must be some extraordinary beauty, which ordinary men can't see, but extraordinary men do." In the sport of athletics, as in crew, athletes come to find meaning in the preparation. Pocock shared with the boys, when you're rowing well, it's near perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine. Olympian Eric Liddell said it this way: "God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure." I also chose this book because, in the words of Joe Rance's granddaughter, rowing saved my grandfather's life. The hero of this story, Joe, lost his mother when he was 3 and spent the rest of his childhood being abandoned off and on. That experience made him feel expendable, perhaps worthless. He felt relying on others was dangerous, and the only person you could trust was yourself. But life is all about connection. A sense of community is a significant human need. And sport was the vehicle through which Joe's heart could be made whole. Sport and a special coach helped him learn how to connect, how to trust and depend on others. This book also appeals to the history teacher in me. The historical backdrop to this inspirational sports story is just fantastic. The story begins at a compelling point in American history, the start of World War I, up to the brink of World War II. The story is set in times that may feel a little like our own. There was a lot of uncertainty in the world. Much of what was going on was out of the control of the common man. Odd weather patterns wreaked havoc and displaced families. Economic tides also sent families toppling. This is our hero, Joe. He was born in March 1931, 1914, just months before World War I, the Great War, broke out in Europe. That same year, Woodrow Wilson took office, heading up our government. He led us into the Great War in 1917. He was known for resisting Black voters who wanted the government to end segregationist policies. He also resisted female voters who wanted to get the vote. But he was well known for establishing the League of Nations, which was his hope for the prevention of future wars, and the Treaty of Versailles, which placed blame squarely on the shoulders of the German people. They were required to pay staggering reparation sums. They were also required to disarm and to cede territory, none of which sat with the German people very well. Joe was born into a happy home. This picture shows him with his father, Harry, his brother, Fred, and his mother, Nellie. Mom was a music teacher. Dad sold and repaired cars. Not long after this picture was taken, Joe's mother fell ill and never recovered. A grief-struck father disappeared north, and Joe was abandoned to relatives he'd never met. 2 years later, he was reunited with his dad, who had remarried, but Joe was never fully integrated into this new family. 3 years later, their home burned to the ground, and that family was forced to move north. So this picture shows Joe, 9 or 10, with his dad and his dad's new wife and his siblings. He looks pretty happy here. He loved the new digs. He and his dad continued to play piano and sing raucous songs together. His dad built him a wagon and later a sled so he could careen down the mine road. And his dad taught him to keep his eyes peeled and look for hidden treasures. And Joe found plenty. While Joe was happy, his stepmother was not. She didn't appreciate the lowbrow, isolated location. And not too long after moving there, she insisted that Joe be moved out of the home and that he start working for his own room and board. He was isolated. At 13, he was reunited with the family again. His dad had bought a farm in Sequim, Washington, and Joe worked hard at his dad's side to help build and keep the homestead. Then the economy turned very sour. Herbert Hoover was in the White House. He was best known for refusing to use, he ran under the slogan, "A chicken in every pot." He was the quintessential rags to riches story. He made millions before he turned 40. The first office he ever ran for was president, and he won. However, when the economy took a dive, he was best known for refusing to use the power of the federal government to mitigate the impact of the Great Depression. He really believed hard work and perseverance, rugged individualism would turn the tide, perhaps because that had been his own experience. The cardboard shanties that started to pop up in public parks became known as Hoovervilles. Another constant in the late 20s and early 30s were weather events. Dust storms swung out of the west and dumped millions of tons of earth on Chicago. Dark clouds hovered over New York City and Boston, and the winds blew away much of the topsoil of the American Midwest. After the crash of 29, some men abandoned their families. Others hit red lines. 25% of the nation was unemployed in 1930. Across the pond, the impact of the crash was felt as well. This slide shows a woman who's made a dress out of German marks and some children who have made kites out of the paper money as well, showing that in the 1920s, cash in Germany was valueless. It took wheelbarrow fulls to buy a loaf of bread. Germany, the German government had been cranking cash out, making it to deal with the reparation payments that had been foisted upon them at the end of World War I, at the close of the Great War. The US was holding up the German economy by issuing lots of loans. So when Wall Street crashed, they called in those loans and the German economy completely tanked. Into that void marched Hitler. In the 1920s, Hitler was mostly ignored by his countrymen, but for a small core of fanatics who seemed to love his anti-Semitic rhetoric. But in the early 30s, his popularity soared. His simple rhetoric caught hold. He blamed the Jews for the economy, and he had a plan to turn it around. He managed to grab 37% of the vote in 1933, and he grabbed the reins very hard. The crash had an impact on our hero as well. Joe was abandoned by his family yet again. Joe's response was to start putting his dad's lessons to use. There is a solution to every problem. Look for solutions in unexpected places. Think in new and creative ways to solve problems. He told himself to keep his wits about him and to keep his eyes open for opportunities. Joe survived by poaching salmon out of a nearby river and hooch from local bootleggers, which he resold to private clients. He worked for local farmers. He dug irrigation ditches. He hand cranked cream separators. He lugged 120-pound milk containers. He cut hay by hand and forked it into wagons. And he did all this while attending high school. He turned to music to brighten his bleakest days. He shared it with farmer families who invited him to dinner after a long workday. He used it to work his way into the movies without having to pay and onto dance halls on Saturday night. Music drew people to Joe. In fact, it brought his lifelong partner and friend, Joyce Simdar, to his side. Early on in their relationship, he would bring her four-leaf clovers. And he was known for saying, the only time you don't find them is when you stop looking. The Times left most with a terrible sense of unrelenting uncertainty about the future. folks were looking for reassurance, and they found it in Hitler's rhetoric, as well as in FDR's comforting fireside chats. Roosevelt defeated Hoover in a landslide. FDR's New Deal challenged the American myth of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, as well as the idea that the social classes are very fluid. Pew studies indicate that social mobility isn't quite as fluid as one might think. Those born at the top and the bottom of the income ladder tend to stay where they start from one generation to the next. FDR instituted major reforms related to finance, communication, and labor designed to put people to work. Joe was an immediate beneficiary of some of this legislation. He got a summer job right after he graduated from high school with the CCC, the Civil Conservation Corps. He worked paving roads. It was hot, dirty, tiring work, but it helped him save for college. Joe was benefited again by public works projects. He took a job on the Grand Coulee Dam. He was joined there by some of his eventual teammates at the University of Washington. He took the job because it paid especially well. It was very difficult work. You can see them strapped in here. He became a jackhammer man because these guys made a little bit more money. But he worked on a cliffside, taking stone down all day long in what was described as brutally hot conditions. Across the pond, Hitler announces that German Jews are excluded from citizenship. Signs started popping up outside of some businesses saying, "Jews unwelcome." World leaders turned a deaf ear to reports that were leaking out of Germany. If you cross the Nazis, you disappear into prison. Joseph Goebbels met Hitler in 1924 and thought he was absolutely brilliant in his simplicity. Hitler inspired him. He felt a sense of adulation for him, and they worked together to hone and spread the Nazi message. The adulation that Goebbels felt for Hitler, he recreated for the masses. He projected an image of Hitler as a sacred hero, an omnipotent warrior. Goebbels used new technologies to good advantage: film, records, radio, newsreels. He worked to ensure the government owned and controlled the airwaves. He forbade the listening to foreign airwaves or the broadcast of foreign news. He forbade the members of the press to travel, and he placed loudspeakers in every public square. He sold radios at a reduced cost so the government message could be widely spread. Goebbels also brought eye-catching images and slogans to political advertisements. He redesigned campaign posters using bright red ink and large typeface to grab attention. He saw the value of using publicity and marketing ideas to promote a world view. He used big events to shape perceptions of reality, such as the Nuremberg rallies. Goebbels was as instrumental to Hitler's rise as the economic crisis. He created and controlled the party narrative. He created the myth of the Führer. He operationalized an optimistic message and combined it with a will to terrorize the German people. And he was masterful in limiting other perspectives. Goebbels' propaganda principles were: facts don't matter. Make claims you can't support. Ignore opponents who point out the facts. Don't waste your time or energy defending your claims. Simply attack your opponent. Goebbels was all of 5'5" tall, and he had a foot deformity, which caused him to limp. Yet, he was happy to mandate that any child born with a deformity should be euthanized. His favorite teachers had been Jewish. His early girlfriend was Jewish, yet he found Hitler's racial message inspiring. Goebbels followed the keep it simple, stupid theology. Nazi propaganda was repeated with a stubbornness that drove the wise to desperation. Many thought Nazi simplicity absurd, childish. Some laughed it off, others ignored it. Most failed to recognize their rhetoric was based on fundamental principles that worked. Make emotional appeals. Goebbels believed facts didn't matter, but feelings did matter. He believed messages must evoke feeling, and the strongest emotions are fear and hate. He said, don't waste your time or effort on the intellectual. You won't win them over anyway. Make your message feel right to the common man on the street. Nazis claimed they would cut costs for food in the cities and raise prices in the country. They didn't sweat the contradiction. Sometimes the common man wants 2 + 2 = 5. So Hitler told them that he would make it so, and that felt right. This is Leni Riefenstahl. She plays a very big role in the Nazi propaganda machine. She wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the movie The Blue Light, which won her critical acclaim internationally. It also caught the attention of Hitler. Hitler asked her to produce films for him, and Goebbels forwarded the funding. Her first major documentary or propaganda piece was The Triumph of the Will. The opening frames of this movie speak of the suffering of the German people at the hands of the world powers who forced the Treaty of Versailles. Her picture then cuts to light showing through the clouds, shows Hitler's plane drifting through those clouds and overlooking Germany, descending toward a picturesque town. Hitler looks out upon high-stepping soldiers in parade formation and then lands to receive the people's adulation. Riefenstahl created the image of Hitler as a savior and the masses who worshiped him. Her film won critical acclaim and has continued to be seen as a masterful propaganda piece. The Nuremberg rallies were an anthem to power, which Goebbels orchestrated and controlled. They were designed to concentrate and advance Nazi power. Riefenstahl's job was to capture it on film and amplify the message to a wider audience. The images she produced defined the iconography of Nazi Germany. Images were enlarged in monumental constructions and stone forms to evoke thoughts of the Roman Empire, as well as to inspire aspirations toward a German empire. Meanwhile, our hero is about to start college. About 50% of Joe's peers at the University of Washington had to figure out how to pay their way through college in 1933. Joe wanted to make the crew team because he knew it would guarantee him a part-time job somewhere on campus. 175 boys showed up on the first day of practice to try to make one of the 8 seats on the freshman boat. Joe noticed that the boys with the creased pants and the shiny loafers didn't last too long in the fight to make the team. He and a handful of boys, sons of farmers, loggers, fishermen, dock workers, who were used to enduring long hours of daily physical work, ended up sticking it out and making the freshman boat, which went undefeated that spring. Joe was attracted to the sport in part because the shell house provided stability and home. Joe tended to arrive to the boathouse early and stay late. He was a talented rower, yet he struggled with inconsistency in the boat over his sophomore season. His coach, Al Ulbrichson, criticized, cajoled, and threatened some of the talented sophomores, including Joe. But he didn't get the results he wanted until he asked George Pocock to step in and to spend a little extra time with Joe to try and figure out what was going on with that boy. Pocock began to invite Joe up to his shop after practice. He showed him the tools that he worked with and told him about the wood that he had selected. He spoke to Joe about the wood as if there was something sacred and holy about it. He shared, "The wood teaches us about survival, about overcoming difficulty, prevailing over adversity. The wood teaches us about the underlying reason for surviving in the first place, to express infinite beauty, to express underlying grace, and to become engaged in things larger than ourselves." Pocock went on to explain that the strength of the cedar was its ability to yield, to bend, to give way, and to accommodate. He mused that that might be the source of strength in men as well, if they were guided by principle. He explained the craft of building a boat was similar to rowing in a boat. He said, "It's like religion. You cannot simply master the technical details of it. You have to give yourself over to it. You have to surrender to it. When you are done, you must feel as if you've left a piece of yourself behind in it forever. A bit of your heart. Rowing and life are like that." George encouraged Joe to start trusting the boys in the boat, to harmonize with them, and not to feel that he had to pull all on his own. Pocock was interested in the grain of the wood that formed the boat, as well as the grain and the fiber of the boys who would fill it. Slowly, he managed to get Joe to talk about himself, to share his story. Pocock encouraged him to let his guard down. Trust was the key to really being part of the boat. Certainly, the Washington crew had not been protected from the storms of the times, and perhaps the hardships that they had endured, the uncertainty that they felt, formed and shaped their resilience. Pocock told the boys, "The enemy is the resistance of the water, but that very water that resists you supports you, and so it is with life. The very problem you must overcome also supports you and makes you stronger in overcoming it." This is an 8-oared shell. The rowers face backward in the water as they head upstream. So if we look at this yellow dot represents where coxswain Bobby Mock would have sat facing the stroke, which in this case was Don Hume. The coxswain who sits in the stern steers and calls direction. The oarsmen must rely on her and on their own ability to sense the wind, the water, and one another. Each has their own blade, which they move in and out of the water in perfect unison. When a perfect rhythm is achieved, it's referred to as swing. Swing is such an efficiency, it allows rowers to conserve energy. Swing allows the rowers to feel as if the boat is part of them. When a boat is in swing, it runs unchecked, fluidly, gracefully between pulls. Good swing feels like poetry, and pain gives way to exaltation. One rower describes it this way: swing is total attunement. We all feel each other, the boat and the water. We become one living entity. Another rower describes it this way: when the light is in such a way that the boundaries between water and sky disappear, and we've been rowing in rhythm, the boundaries between us disappear, they dissolve, and that is ultimate bliss. Sociologist Emile Durkheim coined the term collective effervescence to describe the euphoric self-transcendence that individuals who move together may feel. Synchronized movement may be one of the most powerful ways to experience this feeling of connection. It helps to explain why some sports teams may start to feel like a family, and why individuals may feel empowered to walk, run, or ride for a cure. Today, we talk about self-care, those practices that can help us be more resilient, practices that help us bounce back from strain, stress, and the bumps that life throws our way. We may be familiar with practices of prayer or gratitude. And researchers are starting to study and recognize prayer and gratitude and understand the significant impact that they can have on health and happiness. Researchers are also chronicling the impact that regular exercise has on mental health. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to read Kelly McGonigal's book, The Joy of Movement. She points out, exercise gives you energy. It alleviates worry. It helps you bond with others. It protects against depression and loneliness. She also indicates that regular exercise remodels the physical structures of the brain, making you more receptive to joy and social connection. Another book I recommend, Spark, Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain, points out that regular exercise changes the structures of the brain and helps prepare people to learn, that movement actually cues the building blocks of learning. So here's our championship crew. And to be a championship caliber crew, they had to have total confidence, total trust in one another. It allowed them to drive with reckless abandon. Bobby Mock, our coxswain, is sitting right here. In front of him, Don Hume. Behind Don Hume, in the 7th seat, Joe Rance, Stubbs McMillan, Shorty Hunt, Gordie Howe, and at the very back, Roger Morris in the bow seat. Who was in the boat? So we'll start with the bow seat, was at the very back of the boat. The bow seat was occupied by quiet, reserved, gangly Roger Morris, an engineering student. He worked in his family's moving business. The bow has the greatest potential to disrupt the course, the speed, and the stability of the boat. The same is true, but to a lesser extent, for those seated in the 2 and 3 seats. So these 3 guys back here, Roger Morris, Chuck Day, and Gordie Adams, I think, have to be the most technically proficiently boys in the boat, because they can do the most harm. Chuck Day was known as a garrulous prankster, a ferocious competitor, a spark plug who attacked challenges like a bulldog. And he sat right in front of Roger Morris, who was the opposite, quiet, reserved, unspeaking. And Gordie Adams sat right in front of Chuck. Gordie is one of the boys who showed up at the Cooley Dam and knew how to work hard. In the middle of the boat, the engine room, Johnny White, Jim McMillan, and Shorty Hunt, these were some of the biggest boys, the physically tallest and most powerful. And Shorty Hunt, this fella right here, he used to drape his arm around Joe and say things like, "Don't worry, Joe, I've got your back." I also think it's interesting, Jim McMillan was somebody that Joe learned later on was almost as poor as he was, and Joe would stay late and help him clean up, to take care of the janitorial duties in the boathouse so that Jim could get back to his studies more quickly. Joe sat in seat number 7. He had to be as strong as the engine room rowers, but he also had to be particularly alert and constantly in tune with what was happening in the rest of the boat. He had to match precisely the stroke that Don Hume created and transmit the information back to the engine room. Don Hume sat directly in front of the coxswain. He had to always row at the rate and with the degree of power that was called for. And so in the end, it was the stroke who really controlled things. Small and brilliant, Bobby Mock knew how to needle and outsmart the other boats. He was willing to act independently of coach instructions in the heat of competition. In fact, he delayed his sprint until Coach Ulbrichtson was convinced that the race was completely lost at the national championships in Poughkeepsie, New York. In fact, Ulbrichtson sat down, he had disengaged. He thought that the boat had committed suicide, and Bobby Mock brought them through to victory. Mock also thought to pound on the side of the boat at the Olympic Games when the roar of the crowd kept the crew from being able to hear him. Mock realized they might be able to feel the beat that he was trying to set. So this crew weighed in an average of 175 pounds, and they stood an average of 6'3" tall. They would be considered small by today's standards, where the average crew is 6'6" and tops out at 225. Here on Lake Carnegie in Princeton, New Jersey, after they won the Olympic trials, the head official there was from the University of Pennsylvania. That boat took second. They immediately told the boys from Washington that there was no money to send them to the Olympic Games. And it was a significant amount of money they would need to raise, about $5,000 per rower. So UPenn coach told them, don't worry, we've already got the money raised and we're happy to take your place. We'll go to the games instead of you. The coaches started fundraising, and within 24 hours, in the middle of that depression, they came up with the money they needed to send the boys to Berlin. So that was the first hurdle in their way. And here they are, fundraising success, off to Berlin. A few months before the games were set to start, Hitler completely threw aside the Treaty of Versailles. He marched 20,000 troops over here into this territory known as the Rhineland. This was a demilitarized zone because it borders the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And Germany wasn't supposed to have any troops in there. Hitler was very nervous after he marched those troops into this area. He was thinking there would be a response and that France might declare war. However, the Allies had no stomach for war, and England immediately communicated with Germany, don't worry, I'll talk to France and we'll get them to not overreact. And in fact, the Allies did nothing. Hitler realizes, he's happy that it didn't result in war. He wasn't ready for war at that point. He knew he needed a PR win in Paris, London, and New York. And he knew the Olympic Games would provide the kind of PR that he wanted and would buy him time to continue to develop the resources he needed for an all-out war. Goebbels understood the Olympic Games was an incredible world stage, an opportunity to sell the world on civility, hospitality, and innocence. He set about temporarily sanitizing Germany of all anti-Semitic references. He removed all of the Jews unwelcome signs from the host city before the public arrived. And Leni Riefenstahl worked to memorialize the Games in another critically acclaimed propaganda piece, her movie Olympia. This movie was considered one of the greatest sport films ever produced. Her extraordinary accomplishment was capturing the most exciting moments of the Games and executing smooth transitions between events so that when you watched it, you felt you were there. She worked tirelessly to capture the perfect shot. She used innovative filming techniques and synchronized the events to music. In those days, to attach any sound to a moving picture was almost impossible, but she accomplished it with flawless precision that impressed audiences and critics alike. Her movie was considered propaganda because she sewed together wholesome images of grace and beauty with the iconography and ideology of the Nazis. Her intent was to present the new German state as something of an ideal, an end product of a highly refined civilization. Jesse Owens spoiled a bit of Hitler's party, but the fact was the Games accomplished everything Goebbels had hoped it would. The Germans were not expected to beat the Americans in the overall medal count, but they did. The world press saw Germany they could cheer for. They saw a civilized, pleasant, benign society. Like Owens, the boys in the boat were a bright spot at the games. They accomplished the seemingly impossible. They overcame all odds. The decks were stacked against them. The best qualifying time yielded them the worst lane assignment. No one could understand how that could happen. The coaches did not believe that the boys in the boat stood a chance to earn a medal way out on lane 6. They knew that the disadvantage of being out there was 2 boat lengths worth. They couldn't even see the starter from their spot outside in the wind and the chop. And they chose to row with Don Hume in the stroke spot where he always had been, even though he had been fairly ill for a number of weeks. But they pulled off an amazing come from behind victory and won by a matter of a few feet. I want to read just a little portion from the book at the end that author Daniel James Brown includes. I think it's a fitting end. He went to visit this spot on West House in Germany where the boys claimed their victory. And he says, "It occurred to me when Hitler watched Joe and the boys fight their way back from the rear of the field to sweep ahead of Italy and Germany. He saw, but he did not recognize the heralds of his doom. He could not have known that one day, hundreds of thousands of boys just like them, boys who shared their essential natures, boys who were decent, unassuming, loyal, committed, perseverant, would return to Germany dressed in olive drab to hunt him down. They're almost gone now, the legions of young men who saved the world back in the years before I was born. But that afternoon, standing on the balcony of West House, I was swept with gratitude for their goodness and their grace and their humility and their honor and their civility and all the things they taught us before they flitted across the evening water and vanished into the night." Thanks for joining me in this march through this book. I want to close by mentioning I chose the book in part because it reminded me so much of all that we value here at Principia in whole man education. George Pocock was an extraordinary character educator, and he believed rowing was a vehicle in which to teach social, moral, and spiritual values. Mrs. Morgan, our founder, would have loved him. She recognized the physical, mental, social, and spiritual elements weren't separate entities, each needing their own cultivation, but entities intricately tied together that had to be educated together. She shared in The Sewing, "Nothing can be devised to do a better job of bringing some lessons home to students than in the athletics classroom when a coach has an educator's point of view." So.
Great. Thanks, Anne. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. Fabulous job. So everyone, we do have a little bit of time for question and answers. So you can send those in through the Q&A box or in the chat. And while you were presenting, Tom Fuller had a really great chat. I don't know if you probably saw it, but he rowed in a Pocock 8 for 4 years at Amherst.
Did he?
And he was in the number 7 spot like Joe. So really great post there.
Yeah, that's really fun to hear. And I coached at Princeton for a number of years, so I really would hear the difference between the elite institutions that had rowing teams and the versus the couple of teams from the West who felt like they were coming east to upset the party. In fact, we had running trails along Lake Carnegie, and Carnegie's Carnegie built his lake. So you had a multi-millionaire come in, dig up a lake right behind the Princeton athletic fields, just so that Princeton could have a crew team. So when we talk about the elitist sport of the East, Princeton was a fine example of it.
Yes. Well, I'll get us started with a question, Ann. This, of course, is a classic story of the underdog winning, right? And it had that at multiple levels. We all love an underdog story. What do you think makes this particular story so special to you?
Well, I think the fact that these were all 18 to 22-year-olds. And in fact, most of these boys had a year or 2 years left of college when they showed up at the Olympic Games. The Italian team was more of a professional group, and the German team as well. But these fellas, I think the thing that was particularly special about them was that they spent 3 or 4 years working together, and so they had a relationship that went well beyond a few months of training together and jumping into the boat to row. So it wasn't a matter of picking the absolute biggest, fastest, strongest people and putting them in the boat. And one of the things I appreciated in reading the book was understanding that it took a symphony of different kinds of people to be in the boat. You needed somebody like Roger Morris, who was quiet and steady and proficient and technically perfect, along with somebody like Chuck Day, who was going to fight first and ask questions later. So it was a marriage of different personalities, as well as I think those fellows really drew close together. The amount of trust that they developed over 2 or 3 years as they got to know each other, recognizing how important they were to one another. None of the boys that lined up that day wanted to let one of their teammates down. And I think their desire to do it for their brothers in the boat was so strong that they were able to row almost without the work of Don Hume, who, in the book, they described Hume, who was ill, as almost passing out, almost being unconscious in the middle of the race. So much so that the coxswain was saying he thought he was going to start talking to Joe about changing the tempo, changing the rate, because Don was unavailable to him. He didn't seem to be able to see or hear. And I also thought it was interesting, Al Ulbrichtson had decided Hume seemed so sick, he didn't think he could put him in the boat. And so he had a substitute he was going to put in. And the boys over lunch talked to one another. And Al was not somebody that you would cross. And that, I think back in that day and age, it was a little bit, the coaching philosophy was a little bit more my way or the highway. So for the boys to get together and say to the coach, we don't think you're correct, and they almost were saying, we don't care if we win or lose. We've come all this way with Don. He has to be in the boat. And Ulbrichtson respected them enough to say, okay. He was ill. They pulled him out of bed. They basically carried him down to the transport, and they kind of strapped him into the boat. So it also, I think, tells you just how talented this group was. 2 days before in the trials, they had set the Olympic record and the course record. They had the preferred lane 1, and they blew everybody out of the water. And I don't want to say the Germans cheated, but there's no, Kevin, because you're a track and cross country person, there's just no explanation for the strongest, fastest trial runner to get the worst lane draw. And yet the Germans came up with some kind of system whereby they were trying to explain how the fastest boat should get the worst lane. And when they first arrived in Germany, Al Ulbrichtson was talking to the German race officials, and he said, hey, you can't race 6 boats at once because the final 2 lanes are such an incredible disadvantage. No boat should be out there in lane 5 or 6. And yet the way the final was set up, Germany, who had the 3rd fastest time, got lane 1. Italy, who had the 2nd fastest, or maybe the 4th fastest time, got lane 2. Then 2 teams who were pretty terrible got lane 3 and 4. And then the 5th lane went to the 2nd qualifier, England, and the outside lane went to the fastest qualifier, the Americans. And there was no, there just seemed to be no way to fight the German officials who decided this is the way it should be. And so the coaches kind of told their boys, look, we're all for you, but don't expect a whole lot. It's just, you're going to have to, you have so much to overcome. And then the day of the race, they had bad weather. So a bad lane got even worse because the water became very choppy. So what it says to me is, had the Americans been in preferred lane 1, they likely would have won by many boat lengths.
Gotcha. I loved how you described the swing as you're rowing in unison. Is there anything else in another sport that you would say is even remotely close to that?
Well, I don't know. You tell me. If you're on a cross-country course and you're running in a pack and you're working on a particular rhythm, maybe in the first mile, where people are maybe holding back a little bit and trying to run in rhythm, that might be similar.
I would say a little bit more would be a bike group that's working together.
Well, you're good. That's actually excellent. Probably the Tour de France, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, we've had a couple other comments. Rich Beck has talked about his upper school English teacher, Gary Brashaw, was also a top rower at Princeton. So that was neat. And let's talk a little bit about the coach, Al Ulbrichtson. He seemed like the silent type. We have some great coaches nowadays that seem to be the silent type. I'm thinking of Bill Belichick, Greg Popovich. What is it about coaches, great coaches, that kind of make them quiet and don't want to talk to the media?
I think Ulbrichtson really liked to keep his cards close to his chest, right? But I think Ulbrichtson, because he never guaranteed anybody's seat, he challenged the boys daily. There was a tremendous sense of competition. Popovich, I think, is more of a player's coach. He may not be way out there with the media or courtside, but everything I've read about George Popovich leads me to believe that he is a little more like George Pocock, in that he is kind of gently massaging this one and that one before practice, after practice. He will take the whole team out for dinner, assemble his favorite foods, walk around almost like an Italian mother, eat this, try that. He's very working, he very much works to build relationships with all of the people on the team and to try to understand his players off of the court, and thereby building trust. So I would say Popovich and Pocock are very similar that way in this sense of building trust. I would say Ulbrichtson was a little bit more of a taskmaster who was about performance and kind of held the reward of being in the boat over the heads of the boys to motivate them.
Great. Well, I guess unfortunately that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you, Anne, for this great talk. And on behalf of the Alumni and Field Relations team, thank you everyone for joining us on this special afternoon. The recording of this talk will be posted in the next couple of days on our virtual events page. You'll receive a link to that in a follow-up email. And we hope you'll join us for the upcoming events. Remember, as Marilee said, Tuesday, November 17th at noon and 7, college professor Dr. Sarah Andrews will give that insightful talk on the state of democracy in the world. And we'll be announcing the November book club pick Oh, I think Marilee accidentally said November 3rd. The next book club is November 30th. So we'll be announcing that at the end of this week, what book that is for November 30th. So stay tuned for that. And we also hope you'll join us in December for all the virtual Christmas festivities, traditional Christmas sing-along caroling parties, concerts, and more. You can find information on principiaalumni.org/events. And so Ann Pearson will be presenting this talk again at 7 p.m. tonight, Central Time. If you have any family and friends that would like to tune in, send them our way. So thank you all for attending. See you later.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Ann.